With work finally done on my RPG book on game design, for today's critical thought, and for several more in the future, I want to talk about some of the topics and discussions that can go with the genre. And for today, we are talking encounter design. Specifically, what it means to create a random versus a fixed encounter, and why this decision is not as easy as it sounds. I'm assuming at this point, the future Josh is probably putting some kind of a jump scare or something to kind of give the feel of a random encounter just exploding on the screen. But as present or, well, past Josh, I have no idea. So, I guess we'll just say. If there is one aspect of RPG design, most notably JRPG design, that has evolved and changed over the past 30 years, it would have to be the use or the implementation of encounters. Anyone who grew up playing any kind of JRPG on a console from the NES era on probably has had their fair experience of random encounters with violent screen shakes and getting into a turn-based fight again and again and again. But as the RPG genre in of itself evolved, and especially as indie developers began to take over in the 2010s, how you build these encounters and how even the RPG market of itself has grown is giving us some radically different designs. Now, when we talk about kind of classic JRPG gameplay, a lot of these games were some of the ones that boasted or the longest play times. This is when we get to like the 80 to 100 hour plus games. And while that certainly worked, again, 1988, 1991, that kind of era, in 2023, or whenever what year you're watching this, we've moved away from that. And a lot of people have come to realize that random encounters without any real sense of balance or an eye towards UI UX aren't necessarily the best way of building an RPG. Yes, that game is 100 hours long, but how many of that is actually progress, and how many of that is you taking a step, getting into a fight, taking 3 steps, getting into a fight? Now, when we talk about what a random encounter is, just to make sure everyone is on the same page, random encounters can operate under different rules or different methodologies based on the design present. The most common or the basic example is that every time the player's character takes a step in the world, there's an invisible counter going around in the back end. So let's say every time I take a step, it rolls between 1 and 10. If it gets 7 and above, we have a fight. If it's 1 through 6, we don't get a fight. But remember, this is happening every single step that the player is moving around. So you can have situations where you walk 50 steps, you don't get a fight. Take a step, you fight is over, you take 2 more steps, there's another fight. And this is when we have that kind of discussion about pure randomness or pure RNG, and why it doesn't necessarily lead to a curated or controlled experience. Later JRPGs would make things a little bit more apparent how the random encounter system works. In this case, let's imagine we have a bar that can fill from 0 to 100. Every time the player takes a step, that bar will get added like a random amount, maybe 1 to 3. When the bar hits 100%, we have a fight. In this respect, the player is only given a few kinds of states as to what the chance of combat is. Oftentimes it goes green, you're perfectly safe. Yellow, it's getting a little bit sketchy here and there. And then red or flashing is, okay, there's a fight coming. In this respect, the player is given ample time as to when a random encounter will occur. They just don't know exactly. Now, another advantage of this kind of system is that it also means that it is, quite frankly, literally impossible to go from fight, take a step, another fight, because this bar has to grow. And it allows the game to kind of give the player that somewhat of a breathing room, especially when we get to RPGs that feature dungeons that act as puzzles and massive areas to explore. But even that has changed over the past 10 or so years. Maybe a little bit more than that in terms of some better UI UX work. Now, to kind of switch gears for a second, when we talk about a fixed encounter, what that means is that every fight in your game, whether it is 30 fights, 200, 85, whatever, these are personally and hard-coded and handmade by the designer, so that there is a literal limit to the number of fights you can have in this game. And this is something that we see from a lot more kind of modernized RPG or modernized JRPG design. Stuff like Super Mario RPG, there's a few other ones as well. The problem with, there's kind of pros and cons to both, of a pure random and a pure fix. As I said a few minutes ago, the problem with a 100% random experience or random encounter is that it can really bog down the game and it stops the player from really being able to enjoy the rest of the game or make progress. The problem when it's 100% fixed is that as a designer, you need to be very well aware of how much power the player or the player's characters have at any given time. If I miss, let's say I accidentally missed 2 fights in an area, and now I can't even level up enough to fight the boss, how am I supposed to progress? Or if leveling is that big of a deal, like a gear rating score. And what we have seen over the past 10 or so years, and I would say maybe even longer than that, maybe even as far back as in the 2000s, were designers coming up with ways of kind of having their cake and eat it too, with some very unusual and unique quality of life features. So one of them is actually being able to dictate what is the encounter rate at any point in the game. So this would be in games such as, I remember, Bravely Default back for the DS, where at any point in time you can tweak the encounter rating to be 0, 100% or normal, or 200%, which means almost every step you're getting into a fight. And what this allows someone to do is it effectively allows them to budget their experience. If I want to focus on exploring this dungeon, get all the treasure chests, complete all the puzzles, make it to the boss, and I don't really want to stop and fight, I can do that. Let's say I want to grind some encounters, get some more experience or job levels, I'll bump it up, and then it's just basically fight, 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 and like that. Some games have adopted almost a halfway between the two of a random and a fixed encounter. This would be games like the Paper Mario game that we play way back feels like a few years ago, but I think it was just earlier in 2023, where every time the player saves or reloads a game or kind of goes from screen to screen, all the enemies on that screen will respawn. But the player is free to actively engage or dodge with the enemies as they see fit. So you kind of get the benefit of having fixed encounters, so the player knows when there's going to be a fight, but they can also dictate how much and how often they're going to fight. Now, other kinds of RPGs, what they will do, and this is one of the systems that I kind of like, is they actually make the encounters, or how you encounter enemies, as part of the system of how you progress. Most noticeably, this occurred in The World Ends With You, one of my favorite games from the DS. How this worked was, as you run around the field, you can see kind of these random encounter icons floating around on the stage. You can pull encounters together by running close around to kind of aggro them, and then you can decide how many active fights you want to have in the next battle, or how many waves. The more waves you fight, obviously the more risk you have, but it also affects how much experience, resources, and the greater chance of getting better stuff out of those fights. So it made sense that if you wanted to get more stuff or do it faster, to make things a little bit more challenging. And that to me is kind of one of my favorite aspects of games like this, where you build an incentive to make the game more challenging or to force a player into combat rather than just forcing everyone into the same kind of encounter. With that said, there is an important aspect of encounter design that I want to talk about before we begin to wrap things up for today's video. And that is how you actually build encounters. Because it can be very easy to think that, well, if it's a random encounter, that means it just picks any random enemy and puts that into the battle. And with that sentence, some RPG designer just got a chest pain. What you need to be considering as a designer is what kind of battles you want the player to get into, and this is often done on a biome by biome or area by area basis. What I'm fighting in the first forest should be very different than what I'm fighting in the 6 underground cave that I found somewhere in the countryside. And you want to build encounters around different difficulties, different kinds of sets of enemies, but you need to be mindful of how you combine these fights. So here's an example I kind of talked about in my RPG book. Let's picture 2 different encounters, and we have an enemy called the Necromancer. The Necromancer only has 2 attacks. One, that it attacks you and gains health back, and the other one is that it can revive any defeated enemy at half strength. Now, let's say we build a few encounters that are like a Necromancer and 3 rats. Necromancer and a Spearman. Necromancer and, I don't know, a monkey. Doesn't sound that bad. Let's say, on the other hand, we have a giant ogre. And this enemy has like 10,000 health, it does massive damage, it can taunt, and it can stop the player from attacking anyone else. Let's put that Necromancer in a group of 5 of those guys. Suddenly, we have a bit of a problem. The Necromancer can just keep reviving whoever the player kills, even at half health. If this character has like 10,000 points of HP compared to, let's say, a Necromancer with 150, it's going to be near impossible to get to him. And if he keeps taunting, and there's no way to bypass that taunt, the battle is essentially infinite. And you have to, again, understand how your different abilities and powers will synergize. With that said, I'm sure a few of you who are designing or thinking about RPG design, with my example, you've probably already figured a few ways or a few alterations to these mechanics to keep that from happening. And that's something you need to be considering. How do these different interactions work with each other, and how can the player properly defend against it? As I said a few minutes ago, you do not want 100% random encounters, where it could be one encounter is 2 mice, 3 snakes, and a raccoon. The next encounter is 75 elder death dragons who can each one-shot the player apiece, and they just show up randomly at one point in the game. Some designers will design like a very spiky or unique encounter that has a low chance of occurring. This is some of the stuff that was seen in several Final Fantasy games. The Shin Megami Tensei games have done this as well. And this can be a fun way of kind of tricking the player's expectations, but you do need to, again, give a overall sense of balance to your encounters. Because, again, how many fights the player needs to do, what kind of fights, this all affects the pacing of your RPG, and you do want to be very careful how the experience or what the player gets experience-wise from an encounter translates to the rest of the area. If every enemy encounter group in an area is, let's say, level 3, level 5, and then the boss fight is level 15, well, how much grinding is the player going to do to get to that level, to be able to actually stand toe-to-toe against it? And again, it all depends on what kind of leveling systems you have. How much does leveling matter versus gear or equipment? To wrap things up for today, encounter design is one of the many very subtle aspects of RPG, CRPG, JRPG design. And for every different example, every different kind of RPG, you need to approach things differently. As we all know, in something like a strategy RPG or a tactical RPG such as an XCOM, one additional enemy and encounter group can completely change the difficulty and what the player can do in it. While in other games, you can throw like 20 enemies at the player, but if they're all approaching one at a time, or they only engage if the player gets within an attack radius, then it's not really that big of a deal. And as I said, some of my favorite examples of RPG design in this respect are the games that kind of tie the act of combat into a greater sense of skill. Being able to sneak up on an enemy and hit them to get a free hit. Being able to dodge them on the world map to try and avoid them. The Persona games have done this, I believe, starting with, I want to say 3, maybe 4. It's been a while since I've played them. Oh, I'm pretty sure it is 3. The first 2 are kind of just 100% JRPG. But starting from 3 on, you can see the enemy on the field. If you hit him in the back, you get a free turn. If they hit you, they get a free turn, which in a game like that can oftentimes spell horrible, horrible disaster. But besides those, can you think of games that really made the encounter design interesting? We're not talking about battle mechanics just yet, but just the act of being able to engage or disengage with the enemy as you see fit. And there are games that really take this to an extreme example. Fear and Hunger 1 and 2 also make the act of fighting very engaging because it is ludicrously dangerous. This is a game where one wrong move, your character loses an arm, or a leg, or all your limbs, or something worse happens. And it really kind of built itself up as the tagline of a survival horror RPG, where fighting is the last thing on the player's mind. It's, let me get past this guy while keeping my entire body intact. If you can think of any other examples, let me know in the comments down below, and if there's any other points about RPG design you want me to cover for a future video, please let me know in the comments down below. Do all that YouTubing stuff people tell you to do, visit our Discord and Patreon. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, be sure to check out my game design books, pre-order Game Design Deep Dive RPGs for a massive, massive lesson on a lot of RPG systems and design, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.